a lot of the media are trying to portray this as good versus evil. I think that both sides are, equally to blame, but obviously RSF have committed far more atrocities than the SAF. Any deal that will be struck in Sudan means the RSF will sit at the table, means the UAE will sit at the table. What happens in Sudan is not an option. This is not an optional war. This is not a war of choice. For the Egyptian military, that's existential. The Israelis, like the Emiratis, they have the same vision for the region. They would like to have authoritarian dictatorships, keeping a lid on mobilization. Islam is granting people authority and agency against tyranny and dictatorship. It's a mobilizing force. Whether you want to call it political Islam or not, you don't need to be an Islamist, but if you're a Muslim and you believe in it, there is a mobilizing element to it.
Welcome to the Salam and Kalam podcast, Dr. Andreas Krieg. I'm glad to have you on the podcast. And today is our topic about the situation in Sudan. Several things happened and several, you could say, escalations too happened in Sudan. It's been a region that has been relatively ignored from a global perspective in terms of the severity of it. And I personally would say also in the kind of who the political actors are that are involved. So I'm glad to have you here as an expert. And I would ask you right out of the gate, if you would describe the situation in Sudan, where would you start? It goes a little far back, but if you can give an introduction to kind of where is the most logical point to start off when it comes to explaining what is happening there.
Yeah, I think we have to start off by looking at 30 years of Bashir's authoritarian military rule. I think that was something that really grabbed Sudan, contained any civil societal activity, contained any element of liberal discourse. So a highly repressive regime, which was military-led, but also Islamist-led. So it's an Islamist military regime for 30 years. And so in the decay of that regime, which already had a relationship, obviously, with the military, which today, I mean, if we look at Sudan today, there's two parties really clashing, which is the SAF, which is the Sudanese Armed Forces. So Bashir very much relied on them. And on the other hand, you have the militia, the RSF, which also was one of the militias that Bashir relied upon. So both of these actors have their roots in the Bashir regime. But so in 2018, 2019, we have this popular revolution in Sudan against the crumbling rule of Bashir. And what we see afterwards is that the military, together with the RSF, basically staged a coup and exploited the mobilization during the revolution to kind of create a military dictatorship. Over time, there was obviously external pressure to make sure that there is a transition to civilian rule. And for a year or so, they had a kind of quasi-front, a civilian front to this military rule to kind of allow for a transition to full civilian governance. That never really materialized. The civilian government that was put in place was then again undermined and captured by the military and by the RSF in 2021. And so Sudan then moved into a full military dictatorship, quite repressive, where the RSF is also using violence against protesters. And this sort of relationship, which was almost like a sort of a dual relationship between the RSF and Hemedti and Burhan and the SAF, was going to clash at some point, because you can't, in a dictatorship, you can't have two dictators. So eventually one of them would have had to come out on top. And when the military was asking for the RSF as a militia to integrate into the chain of command of the military under these auspices of security sector reform, this is when it really started clashing. And the RSF then tried to stage a coup against the SAF. And meanwhile, the SAF was also preparing the ground to stage a coup against the RSF. So neither party really is to blame, because both of them are to blame, and both of them are a direct consequence of 30 years of a military dictatorship under Bashir. But obviously what we've seen over the last 2 years, so that coup that happened in 2023, that really led to the civil war, the falling out between the SAF and the RSF, this is really what led to the civil war that we see today, and the RSF obviously being the most atrocious in terms of the tactics that they're using in this civil war. But the other side, the SAF, is, they're not the goodies. I mean, a lot of the media are trying to portray this as bad, good versus evil. I think that both sides are, equally to blame, but obviously RSF have committed far more atrocities than the SAF.
So you went a very great overview. My question would be, Omar al-Bashir is quite one of the I wouldn't say the generation of dictators that have been in place for a couple decades. That is in the MENA region, like the regime of Mubarak and others, and Gaddafi. So this, would you say that the government of al-Bashir was kind of like the same, or like it was a generation of after the Second World War, a kind of nationalist identity that stayed for a while, and then with the Arab Spring it all fell apart? Or just to have an overview of what led to the chaos that we see today?
So I think the Bashir regime doesn't fit as neatly into the Nasserite sort of Arab nationalist dictators that have come out after the post-colonial period, and they came out of the Second World War. I think they're the Bashir regime, because it was a military dictatorship in that respect. It kind of fits into the overall pattern that we've seen in Gaddafi, Assad in Syria, that we've seen with Saddam in Iraq. But obviously, Bashir was able to sustain the Arab Spring. There wasn't really a lot of uprising in 2010, 2011, so he was able to sustain this. And also, he was not just a military dictator. I mean, he was also, as I said, he was drawing on various other power poles in the country, like the Islamist factions. And so, he was able to sustain the Arab Spring, but he was certainly an ancien regime, if you will. From today's perspective, he was certainly a relic of a time that it no longer exists. And I think what we've seen, and this is where the Saudis and the Emiratis come in as foreign backers, because they saw the opportunity to get rid of these Islamist factions, getting rid of Bashir, and establishing a novel form of military dictatorship. Because the Sisi regime, for example, in Egypt, is a regime that doesn't neatly fit into the category of the Mubarak regime. It's very much a neo. It's a new form of military dictatorship, and so the Emiratis have been pushing for these sort of military dictators, which are a bit more responsive to the public in terms of they're looking at stability also through an economic lens. They're far less nepotistic, although what happened with Sisi is the contrary. I mean, he became extremely nepotistic. But basically what I'm saying here is that Bashir was, yes, he was an old regime. He fell, and Burhan almost looked like he could be this new type of post-Arab Spring dictator that could keep a lid on civil societal mobilization.
You have mentioned in a couple of your articles that the UAE and kind of the Gulf states started to have like more interest into the MENA area in the 2010s. So was Sudan more of an isolated country that has like internal strifes, or were there no outside interventions or influence whatsoever? And then it came after the Arab Spring, when this agenda of clamping down on Islamist parties, etc., came about.
Now, Sudan is, situated geostrategically at a very interesting crossroads between the Red Sea, Horn of Africa, and also obviously Northern Africa and the Middle East. So it has always had some value and, penetration of the country. Obviously, you can go back to colonial times. Obviously, it used to be part of the British Empire. But even in the 90s, the Bashir regime was penetrated. It had, it was hosting Iranian facilities. So the Iranians had a relationship with them. Later on in the 2000s, we've seen the Emiratis moving in terms of, for agricultural reasons, buying of land. They had a relationship with Qatar. They had a relationship with Saudi Arabia. They all saw Sudan as a very important player, but obviously Sudan doesn't fit as neatly into the Arab world, as into the center of the Arab world, because it's a very diverse country. We have this genocide in Darfur in 2003 as well, which was an internal Sudanese struggle, and obviously the Janjaweed. Later, they emerged from that genocide and then formed the RSF or were formalized into the RSF. So, Hemedti and the RSF really are, they are the genocidal party of 2003. But these were internal Sudanese struggles, and Sudan was somewhat isolated from the kind of regional dynamics that we've seen during the Arab Spring.
So after the fall of Bashir, you mentioned two major parties that emerged that kind of vied for influence and for rulership in Sudan. Could you just like give an overview of who these people are? You mentioned Hemedti, for example, and also that the Janjaweed that came about the genocide, that they are the ones who kind of like turned into the RSF. So who's involved when it comes to the SAF and the RSF?
Let's start with the RSF. So the RSF is a militia. They're a network of different militia groups. There are different core and peripheral militias within that network. I would look at them as a network. They were used as a militia by Bashir in already, in the 2000s, during the genocide in Darfur. They were used by the Bashir regime as a proxy to fight a local battle that the military didn't want to fight. They are from the Chad Darfurian area in terms of ethnically. At the core of the Janjaweed, which kind of the fighters on horseback, if you will, they were a very primitive form of militia. They, at the heart of it, is the Hemedti family. Hemedti and his brothers have kind of created a militia with a commercial sort of network around it that came out of the Darfur genocide in 2003 and were formalized, I think, in 2013 into the Rapid Support Forces, the RSF, which they are today. And Bashir granted them that status. And during that period, after the genocide, the Hemedti family really enriched themselves. They used the gold mines of Darfur to become basically a major commodity trader. Today, the Hemedti family is worth billions of dollars. And they were able to only do this because they had the control of this part of Darfur. And with the billions that they've made through the mostly illicit gold trade, they've been able to really build up the Janjaweed from a, very primitive sort of militia on horseback into a far more advanced militia with, with armed personnel carriers and more, slightly heavier weaponry, and obviously, as of late, use of drones and whatnot. So the core is the Hemedti family, but on the periphery, there are a lot of other militias that subscribe to Hemedti because Hemedti is powerful, he's rich, so he's kind of the patron in that network. But there's quite a lot of autonomy on the periphery where some of these brigades and militia do their own thing in support of the RSF, but it would be wrong to say that Hemedti has full control over that network. And the same is true for everyone who works with Hemedti, especially the UAE. They don't have full control over that network. So that's on one side. The SAF, Sudanese Armed Forces, are obviously...
I just want to interject. I'm sorry, because a lot of my viewers are not familiar with all the happenings that happened in Sudan. So the Darfur genocide, you referred to the genocide several times. Could you just give a summary of what happened and why exactly this came to the formation of the Janjaweed forces that led to the situation you described with the several militias?
Sudan is an extremely diversified country. So it's not we always portray it as two sides, kind of a binary conflict. It's a highly diverse country, ethnically, linguistically, and Darfur in itself is a rig-rag of different ethnic groups, tribal groups, which are transnational. They don't just live in Darfur. As I said, they have ties to Chad, and so this conflict in Darfur has predates. Obviously, this civil war predates even the genocide in Darfur. Gaddafi, for example, has been using some of these tribal factions for his wars against Chad. So in this part of Africa, this has been a transnational conflict, and in order to in this war against insurgents in this part of Darfur, the Bashir regime, instead of using the military, basically used the network around Hemedti to kind of build a militia that, with absolute, in an atrocious way, was suppressing not just the insurgency, but actually, used it to ethnically cleanse certain areas, killing civilians. And, there's this long track record of Hemedti engaging in something that can't be described as a counterinsurgency, but as a very, very bloody, very bloody genocide with the intent of destroying an entire people in the area. And so that these kind of divides are along ethnic lines. But I would, what's interesting is that in 2003, the US government, who never used the genocide term, actually called this a genocide. So this is one of the few occasions in history, actually, where we have the US and other Western countries calling a situation a genocide. And so that happened in 2003. And the Janjaweed really came out victoriously, and they were rewarded by the Bashir regime for the violence and the decisiveness with which they actually clamped down on these other groups.
So the other groups are the Sudanese in terms of like their nationality, or you said diverse tribes. You always hear that there is a kind of African Arab enmity and racism that is underlying in this entire conflict. So maybe you can shed light on when we talk about the civilian population in Darfur and in Sudan in general, who are we talking about? Like, who are the people who live there, and why is it that they seem to be in the crosshair of all of these militias, to the point that you talk about that led to a genocide?
No, the tribal groups are, again, quite diverse. I think an easy sort of divide to look at for most people to remember, which also led to the secession of Southern Sudan. I think that was in 2011. South Sudan seceded from Sudan and became its own country. So the divide that you see in what was colonial British Sudan, which obviously, again, as always, you had these borders drawn quite artificially. You have an African, black African part of the population and an Arab African part of the population. And so the Arab, obviously Arabs being the Arab Sudanese being Muslim, and a lot of the black Africans being Christian, but there are also different ethnicities involved in that. And that sort of conflict led to the secession of Southern Sudan as well. And a lot of that conflict was also that came to the forefront also in Darfur in the early 2000s.
Which group was it that suffered the most in the Darfur genocide, and what is it exactly that motivates the Janjaweed, and who are they? Who are the Janjaweed that came out of this massacre that you talked about? I made a quick research, and it seems it's not as simple as one religion versus the other, but it's more drawn. It's more along ethnic lines, as you kind of hinted at. But if you can just give a just very short overview about what happened that galvanized this conflict into the creation of this militia, and then that came over as a tool or as a partner, whatever you want to call it, to Hemedti's regime or organization.
So as I said, so you had this conflict between Sudan, northern Sudan, southern Sudan, which was along different ethnic but also religious lines. Darfur was a micro conflict of this bigger conflict. As I said, Sudan is extremely divided. And so what you have in Darfur, you had a rebellion against, especially by those who are deemed by Arab Sudanese as being quote unquote Africans, black Africans. They were basically demanding for more rights. There was a very small sort of insurgency group that came out of it. And so under the pretext of fighting an insurgency, Bashir didn't want to use the military, so he relied on a local proxy, which was Hemedti and his family. And that's basically where the Janjaweed are coming from. And they basically are Arab Sudanese fighting against what they call African Sudanese. And so there were different ethnic groups that were targeted, a variety of them. But the easiest way to describe it is basically Arab Sudanese versus what they call African Sudanese. And that the pretext was a counterinsurgency, but it was really about control of land. I mean, Darfur had a lot of stresses already at the time, environmental nature, some of obviously nomadic groups as well, who need land for herding and for their cattle. So it was access to land as well, but it's also because some of that land is quite important economically because of gold reserves and whatnot. The pretext was used basically by Hemedti to basically seize more territory, push out these groups towards other parts of either towards the border or further towards the south. And then it was pure racism. I mean, racism was really the narrative that kind of galvanized the Janjaweed into, what we would call a kind of a genocidal sort of militia. And Bashir kind of relied primarily on the Janjaweed to fight that. And the atrocities, therefore, can be very much attributed to the RSF.
So you can say that Sudan already always had a conflict along ethnic lines, but is it clear cut that it's, you could say, Arab Sudanese against African Sudanese, or is it somewhere in the middle, or has it always been consistently a kind of like this racist undertone of seizing land for your own ethnic group, whatever?
I mean, in these kind of border areas where borders are porous anyway, where the border between Chad and Darfur is not a border that is very well manned or mannable. So these groups, and some of them were nomadic, so they move over from one jurisdiction to another. So it doesn't really matter in the end whether they're Sudanese or whether they're Sudanese citizens or not, because it doesn't matter in this conflict. It also, I think, this divide between, let's say, the people of Darfur, which are quote unquote Black African, and which are and those who are Arab Sudanese, that is obviously one of the elements in this civil war, but it's not the main element in this civil war. Obviously, a lot of that racism is now coming to the forefront as the RSF is really clamping down on trying to basically conquer more territory in Al-Fasher, what we saw over the last couple of weeks. And a lot of that racism is coming out. A lot of the atrocities committed follow the same pattern that we had in 2003. But really now it's not about ethnicity. It is about power. It's about money, and it's about control of territory. And ultimately, what the RSF wanted to do, obviously, was capture Khartoum, which they weren't able to do.
Right. So we can go back to the kind of political actors that are acting now. We were about to introduce the different parties. You were about to talk more about the SAF and who's heading them, where do they come from, and what's their role in this entire situation.
The Sudanese armed forces were the main power backer, or sort of the spine, the main pillar of the regime of Omar Bashir as well. As I said, they were a military dictatorship.
The formal army.
Very formal, the formal armed forces of Sudan. There are obviously factions in it, certain networks as well that connect to the SAF. But in comparison to the RSF, which I would widely say they're a network of different militias, here we have the SAF as a formal military with a formal chain of command, with different combined arms forces. So you've got your artillery, you've got your engineers, you've got your intelligence, you have an air force. So it's much more. It looks a lot more like a regular military, and hence it is quite remarkable that the RSF, which is everything but a regular military, which for a long time didn't have the resources that a former military had, whether it's tanks or an air force, that this RSF, which were fighters on horseback, were able to, or have been able to, fight the SAF to a stalemate. And that was only possible because the RSF has been elevated to a much more potent a military force through external support.
So does that mean that the army is way more diversified in like the kind of ethnicities that like fight there, or is it also organized along certain ethnic lines? I mean, it's the formal military, so
The SAF is far more representative of Sudan and Sudanese ethnicities. I think they have far less of that ethnic undertone and that sort of racial undertone in terms of mobilizing people than the RSF. So you can very much say that the SAF is far more of an inclusive organization ethnically than the RSF.
but you also okay, so it's great. So who is heading both of these parties? And
So as
what
I
are the
said, well, RSF is the family of Hemedti, particularly Hemedti himself, the warlord, but also the rest of the family, because it's a big network of different companies behind it. And then obviously different militia leader who, each militia group has their own leader. They act with with a degree of autonomy around the core of the RSF.
So
And
he's acting more as a warlord, as you said, because he's very rich out of his like dealings in the territories that he holds.
yes. So Hemedti, as I said, he started already in the early 2000s to go into the
Yeah.
gold trade, mostly gold trade, and that kind of, he was able to illegally mine gold and then export it mainly through the UAE, but not only exporting the gold, but translating and laundering that gold and translating it into tangible cash, with which he could purchase any other thing that he needed, military support and whatnot, and bringing it back into Darfur. And on the other hand, you've got Burhan. Burhan, chief of staff, was the head of the army during the coup against Bashir, and he kind of cultivated himself into a military and political leader. If you look at it from the outset, very much your standard military dictator, who comes from the military, who says he's doing what he's doing to save the country, getting rid of the old dictator Bashir, working on behalf of the people, responding to the popular demand of the people during the revolution, but actually over time becomes a military dictator. And hence why I said both of them, Hemedti and Burhan, they're both of them are baddies, if you want. There isn't a good side and a bad side, as the media sometimes wants you to believe.
What is it that that is not necessarily reported on the SAF that makes this conflict, or makes you say that there is not really a good or bad side in this entire thing?
No, because the SAF is, they're probably more representative of the Sudanese people than the RSF. No doubt. I mean, the RSF is a genocidal militia, as I said, but the SAF as an organization, the military, especially the people around Burhan, also have no interest in a civilian government and a transition to civilian governance where they would be subservient to a civilian leadership. They want to rule. And that's certainly not, I don't think, is in the interest of those people who went to protest in 2018 and 2019 in Sudan. I mean, that's not what they went to the streets for. They didn't want to replace one dictatorship with another dictatorship. Also, the SAF in the way that they're using the Air Force. I mean, there's been a lot of targeting, which was either disproportionate use of force, or they were unwilling to differentiate between civilians and combatants. So a lot of people were killed by them as well. There were allegations of war crimes as well, not on the scale or not with the atrocities that we've seen on the RSF side, but also there's been accusations of cleansing supporters of the RSF from certain areas. So both of them are not fighting. This is not a civil war where one side is fighting along the lines of the laws of armed conflict and the other one isn't. I mean, both of them don't really regard the laws of armed conflict very highly, although I would say the SAF operates more like a regular military than the RSF.
So you mentioned in your art, I want to go to the articles that you wrote specifically on the UAE's influence, which is maybe the main point that is interesting maybe to people, which is when did this influence coming out of Dubai or Abu Dhabi come into Sudan suddenly? And what is the general attitude of the UAE when it comes to their influence in Sudan? And maybe you can take it as a point to explain its general strategy in the MENA region.
Right, there's like 4 different questions in there.
Oh, okay, then let's start.
So let's start from the beginning. So the UAE is a country, obviously small state by most metrics, but is a country that has really understood how to generate power with the means available to themselves, and most of the means obviously being petrol, dollars, and translating that into power. More so than other Gulf states. So the UAE have, under the leadership of Mohammed bin Zayed, who's the president, and his brothers, they've really developed into a mercantile, strong state. Some people refer to it as Little Sparta. And after the Arab Spring in particular, they've become very active and proactive and assertive in enforcing and trying to achieve their objectives in the region. They see the region as being in a power vacuum, because the US has gradually withdrawn. The UAE wanted to fill some of it, or at least they said, okay, if the US is withdrawing, then we have to fend for ourselves and we have to achieve objectives as we see fit, because nobody else is going to help us out. So after the Arab Spring, which they consider to be a major threat to regime security, unlike other Gulf states, the UAE in particular saw the rise of Islamist groups, rise of civil societal groups, and the decline and decay of authoritarian leadership in the region as a major source of instability. So after the Arab Spring, they really wanted to clamp down on these revolutionaries and pushed basically a counter-revolutionary agenda by supporting actors who are, usually strong men in uniform, to kind of push back against these revolutionary tides. They achieved that in Egypt in 2013. They were very instrumental in backing the Egyptian military and the intelligence in 2013 to stage the coup against the Muslim Brotherhood government of Morsi. They, in 2014, backed the somewhat failed coup by Khalifa Haftar, again a strong man in uniform, an old field marshal of the Gaddafi era, and helped him to come to power in eastern Libya. They then obviously went into Yemen in 2015, again, relying on the RSF, funny enough, and Hemedti, with whom they've had a long-standing relationship, mostly a commercial relationship, since the early 2010s. And Hemedti's militias, the RSF, was used as a mercenary force for the UAE to fight in Yemen. And in Yemen, they built the STC, the Southern Transitional Council, as a non-state actor that they're supporting and kind of building their own enclave within Yemen. And then obviously, with 2018, 2019, they have the revolution in Sudan. And that was a double-edged sword for the UAE because on the one hand, they wanted to get rid of Bashir because Bashir was penetrated by Islamists or working alongside or with Islamist factions, parties, and militias. And so they wanted to get rid of him. And there was an opportunity to say, okay, let's maybe put in the SAF, push them as a leader in Sudan to take over from this other dictatorship and maintain a lid and keep a lid on that mobilization that happened in 2013, 2019. For the UAE, when they see people protesting, civil societal mobilization for them, to them, is a major source of instability. It's unpredictable. And obviously they themselves are an extremely authoritarian country, more so than other countries in the region, more so than other Gulf countries. So they're not just autocratic, they're very authoritarian and repressive. And so they wanted to see the military take over during the revolution. And hence they went into Sudan backing both Burhan and Hemedti. And as I said, with Hemedti, they had that long-standing commercial relationship. They didn't favor one over the other. They thought the two could work together. And the problem really only escalated in 2023. So we had 4 years where the UAE were backing both sides, and they still have a relationship with both sides. That's very important to bear in mind. They're obviously funding the RSF militarily in terms of training and financially as well. But more than that, they also have that relationship still with factions in the SAF. The UAE, what do they want in Sudan? For them, obviously, as I mentioned before, agriculture. The Gulf states need arable land. They don't have arable land. Sudan has arable land. Sudan is at a very important crossroads between Northern Africa, the Sahel, the Horn of Africa, the Red Sea. And so for them, it was a potential logistical hub and a logistical crossroads. They wanted to build, a port hub in Sudan that connects to the other ports that DP World and Abu Dhabi ports already control in this part of the world. And so for them, it was a very important access point to build a corridor into other parts of Africa, Ethiopia, Eritrea, and also connecting to Egypt and other parts of sub-Saharan Africa. So that's why Sudan is so important to them. And then lastly, obviously, it's about commodities and minerals as well. The gold trade was important. Sudan has a lot of gold, and Dubai really wanted to become a hub for the global gold trade, and hence why Sudan is so important. So, and then there's this little element, as I said before, this Islamist ideological element, which I think now it's a narrative that they're using to justify why they're doing and why they're supporting the RSF. They're saying we're fighting the Muslim Brotherhood or we're fighting Islamists. That is obviously a deep-seated fear, the Muslim Brotherhood, but I think it's an excuse to justify what is mostly now a support for the RSF, where it's about power, where it's about resources, and about territory rather than actually ideology.
So you have mentioned, I personally, I wonder, do they have to go that far in having their hands in fringe, I would say, fringe group at the start? Obviously, with their funding, they turn out to be a force to be reckoned with in the local countries that they operate in. But do they have to go that far? I mean, do they have to fund the RSF to get business going at the ports with gold, etc.? And what is it exactly about the Islamist party that they fear so much that they, as a small country, need to, over the decades that they have operated, just pour money into it in order to maintain control? Is my question?
But first of all, you need to understand the UAE is a small state of 1 million people. There are 1 million citizens in the UAE. It's a very small population. They're very ambitious in terms of how they want to reshape the order after the Arab Spring. This counter-revolutionary push in the region is something that that required a lot of capacity that the UAE don't have. So they need to delegate that to either to the market, as in private military security companies, commodity trading companies, logistics companies, and whatnot. So they've built this massive network, which I call the axis of secessionists, which is not just the fighters on the front, but it's the whole sort of what's underneath that iceberg, which is the massive network of commercial companies. That's how the UAE built their capacity that they usually don't have, and delegating to non-state actors is very important. Also, the UAE are conscious that they won't be able to capture a country. I think Egypt was a one-off where they didn't capture the country. They allowed Sisi to capture the country. But obviously, the UAE is now the most important patron of Egypt, and they control almost every aspect of Egypt. But they're relying on the military, and the military is a force in itself. In Libya, they hoped Khalifa Haftar would be able to take the country, seize it. He didn't manage, but at least he seized a very important chunk of the country, makes him a very important arbiter and intermediary in eastern Libya. Same is true for the RSF, where the RSF will never be able to capture all of Sudan. But the fact that they can capture Darfur, which is resource rich and important, the fact that the RSF is so important that any deal that will be struck in Sudan means the RSF will sit at the table, means the UAE will sit at the table. In Yemen as well, the STC will not be able to capture all of Yemen, but they capture those territories that are important to them, along coastal areas in the south of Yemen. And that's all they want. As long as they can really dig in and hold that territory, the UAE will sit at the table in any sort of negotiation in Yemen. Same in Libya. Any negotiation in Libya will have to go through the UAE. The UAE are sitting at the table because they're the patron of the most important power on the ground, which is Khalifa Haftar. So what the UAE go for is they try to go for the primus inter pares. But that primus inter pares approach doesn't necessarily mean they always need to go for the strongest party, but they need to go with a party that is resilient and that can sustain pressure and resistance. And that's true for the RSF as well. So they need to do it because they don't have the capacity to do it. They're not a big player. They're not a great power, but they're playing great power politics with the means of a small state.
Again, where does this paranoia come from that they have to do it? Like, just couldn't they go about it like in I want to say like normal countries with normal trade? And why is there a paranoia so much about like the revolutions happening in there? You said they are autocratic and authoritarian, and they're a small country. I get that, but is it that more like why is it something that bothers them in a way, or is there a fear that it might spill over into their own country?
Again, we can go very deep, or we're trying to be superficial. But if we go very
I
deep,
see.
but one thing you have to understand is the leader himself, Mohammed bin Zayed. His relationship with political Islam is a very ambiguous one. So he had interactions, he had a relationship with a teacher back in the day, allegedly, who was, not allegedly, who was from the Islamist spectrum. They've fallen out. And so there's a very personal experience with political Islam. There is also the fear that came from being associated with the 9/11 hijackers. Two of them were Emiratis. And so the fear that, after 9/11, every Muslim country would be associated with global terrorism, that's something they wanted to avoid. They wanted to show that they are different from the rest of the region. Then there is this domestic element to it. So unlike, let's say, Oman or Qatar, and even unlike Saudi Arabia, there was an indigenous movement in the UAE that was associated with the Muslim Brotherhood. They called it the Al-Islah Party, the Reform Party. And that reform movement did not just draw on expats who lived in the UAE, but they were able to draw in Emiratis, including members of the royal families. Then we also have to understand that the UAE is a federation of 7 countries. They're not a unitary state. Abu Dhabi is the most important one. They have subverted all elements of statecraft and governance in the country, but there are 6 other emirates towards the north, which are also socioeconomically more dependent on Abu Dhabi. They're not as rich. They're not as well off. And where there are grievances on the ground, where people might be more susceptible to the narratives of political Islam. So the UAE, the obsession, and when I say the UAE, the obsession of Abu Dhabi is very important to understand. It's the royal family of Abu Dhabi. The obsession with political Islam stems from all these different factors. It's the person Mohammed bin Zayed is domestic mobilization, and Al-Islah Islamist party that existed until it was obviously listed as a terrorist organization in 2011. And the fear that domestically Emiratis might be drawn to the narratives of political Islam is just something that goes against the grain of what is very much a Bedouin mentality. Unlike other parts of the Gulf, the Bani Yas or the Al Nahyan, they're very much a Bedouin family. They come from the inland of Arabia. They're not from the coastal areas, although they did settle later on in the coastal areas. But their mentality is very much a Bedouin mentality, which is, you constantly look around your shoulder, you look over your shoulder, you're constantly paranoid that there is a force mobilizing against you. And so hence why for them, political Islam is not just a threat domestically, because if any political Islam, if any Islamic country, party, Islamist party came to power anywhere in the Middle East and was able to succeed, it would be a model that counters the model of the UAE, and that would be a threat. And hence, you need to make sure that they don't succeed, and you need to make sure that that you undermine their power base.
And that is like the mode of this authoritarianism, having like your own hand, your on deck on the entire economy, pushing your own ideology. It seems like the Mohammed bin Zayed and all these Emiratis, they see the state and their money kind of like they're an extension of themselves. So it's like a kind of monarchical approach to life and statehood, as I said. And these revolutions, even especially the political Islam actors, they have more this concept of actually like engaging the population, even if some fail and others not, but engaging the population in order to have some kind of not a strong man, but more of like the people governing or deciding over their own freedom and under God in that regard. So it has the political Islam movement in and of itself is too revolutionary in spirit and for it to coexist in the UAE.
I mean,
Apart from his own maybe as you said, impressions on what political Islam is or is not.
Yeah, so I mean, political Islam is extremely diverse. The Muslim Brotherhood is an extremely diverse organization as well. They obviously what they use, and we can talk about this later. But I mean, the UAE have been using the scarecrow and the boogeyman of Muslim Brotherhood all over Europe, pushing the argument that they are the biggest threat to stability in Europe, which is obviously ridiculous because there is no such thing as a Muslim Brotherhood in Europe per se. There are people who associate with that mentality. But I think what the fear that they have, and that's nothing to do with political Islam. I mean, in Islam, Islam is granting people authority and agency against tyranny and dictatorship. It's empowering people to speak up against tyranny and dictatorship.
Yes.
It's a mobilizing force in itself, whether you want to call it political Islam or not. You don't need to be an Islamist, but if you're a Muslim and you believe in it, there is this element that there is a mobilizing element to it. And the masjid, the mosque, is a place for social political discourse as well. Hence why the mosque has also been seen by the Emiratis as a major threat to their own regime security. So it goes much further than just the Muslim Brotherhood and Islamism. It's really about the mobilizing force of religion that could potentially undermine the mobilizing force of the leadership. Hence why they're arguing they're creating a secular Middle Eastern governance form, which is kind of detached from Islam, where they make a clear divide between religion and state, which is very Islamic, is very unusual for this part of the world, and that has nothing to do with political Islam or Islamism. There's something to do with the fear of Islam.
Fear of Islam itself. So, interestingly, that's a point I wanted to address is some of the militias that are that's what's been reported that are on the SAF side have seen this spirit of Islam coming to fight against the RSF. Is it true that some of these parties are actually like in the Sudanese army, and that the SAF itself sees recent support by Egypt and Turkey, two parties who have been notoriously at each other's throat, actually? So what is, could you comment on that development?
Sudan has a very diverse history of political Islam. There are different, Islamist parties. There are different Islamist movements. There are different Islamist networks, if you will, that all have, some of them have tied into the SAF in Bashir's time, and some of them are still around. And obviously the Islamist factions don't necessarily like Burhan, but for them, it's a choice between a rock and a hard place, and they're choosing the lesser of two evils, and Burhan is the lesser of two evils when compared to the RSF. And hence the Emiratis are saying RSF is there to fight political Islam, which is, really a fringe element of that conflict. All of them have rallied around because they don't want the RSF to win, and obviously RSF is now being deemed by most Sudanese as a threat to national security. The Turks have come in because for them it's about power politics. It's not really about ideology. It's not about them. Obviously, the narrative, the Emirati narrative, is the Turks do this because they want to establish an Islamist regime in Sudan. That's not the case. The Turks had a long-standing relationship with Bashir, and they got along well. But for the Turks, it's about power politics. It's about the same things, about access to trade routes, trade corridors. It's about logistics, and the strategic value of Sudan in this part of the world. For the Egyptians, it's much more than that. It's really not ideological. This is absolutely the key. I would say for Egypt, next to probably the border with Israel and the Sinai, I think the southern border is probably the most concerning national security threat that they're facing at the moment. And for the Egyptian military, what happens in Sudan is not an option. This is not an optional war. This is not a war of choice. For the Egyptian military, that's existential. Sudan has always been existential. And so the support for the SAF, which has been going on for 2 years, is really a matter of survival. They're doing it because they think would the RSF win, they would have this militia on their doorstep, and that would be a threat to their national security. More than that, obviously, the war itself is pushing Sudanese into Egypt at a time when Egypt is already penetrated, where Egypt is, the economy is in tatters, and where Egypt has lots of different problems with Ethiopia, the border with Libya as well as being porous. You've got the issue along the border with Gaza and the Israelis. So the regime is under pressure in Egypt. Egypt is under pressure economically, and the southern border is really something that they cannot negotiate over, and they need to make sure that the SAF wins.
Is there an interest for Israel in this entire conflict? I mean, there hasn't been really much news coming out saying that it's not much reported on that they have a certain role to play, but recent news suggests otherwise. Could you comment on that?
No, the Israelis have an interest in Sudan, very much so. Don't forget, Sudan actually joined the Abraham Accords, was facilitated obviously at the time by the Emiratis, and Burhan signed it off. And there's a two-way approach to this. So the Israelis, like the Emiratis, they have the same vision for the region. They would like to have authoritarian dictatorships keeping a lid on mobilization. The Israelis fear the Arab street. They fear political Islam. They fear free choice and agency of Arabs, because agency of Arab means these are people who will not be friendly towards Israel. Public opinion in the region has never been pro-Israel. It has always been anti-Israel, pro-Palestine. So they don't want these forces to come to power. The Israelis also would like to have a military dictator because it gives them one person, one point of contact they can call if they need something, and Burhan was that person. So the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Israel and the Ministry of Defense have had this relationship with Burhan for a while, but the Israeli intelligence and the Mossad has had meetings with Hemedti as well, and that was facilitated by the Emiratis. So over the last 2 years, we see the Israeli intelligence under the table engaging with the RSF because they see this as probably a more reliable partner because it's facilitated by the Emiratis, and Israel has no strategic depth in Sudan. But if we go back to the 1990s, mind you, the Iranians have been using Sudan as a launch pad for arms smuggling. So the Israelis have an interest to make sure Sudan doesn't fall into the Iranian hands. And obviously Iran has come in as well to support the SAF, providing them with drones. So the Israelis can now make the argument that, in their war against the region, which is no longer just the war against Hamas, but the war against the region, they have to fight back against the Sudanese and the Iranians wherever they can find them. And if the SAF gets funding and support, or at least support in terms of technology from the Iranians, then the SAF is a potential enemy. And I think we've seen that since the 7th of October, a bit of a pivot from Israel via intelligence networks to the RSF.
And they support them with technology, intelligence, or has this been substantiated in some way?
No, I mean, there's no evidence that they do that. So the material that we found in the hands of the RSF has all been procured through the UAE, but it might well be some of the drones are very sophisticated that are flown allegedly by the RSF. They have been flown on behalf of the RSF. Nobody knows who's flying them. It's hard to imagine that the RSF, as I said, they were a kind of a primitive militia are flying these drones. It's more likely that it's either Emiratis and Emirati special forces or contractors, of which the Emiratis have many, and that it's conceivable that the Israelis have contractors that allow them to do that. There's no evidence for that. I'm just speculating right now. There's some Israeli companies involved in this massive network of smuggling arms to the Sudanese to the RSF, but they're not Israeli weapons.
Last question. What do you think in terms of the things that happen in Sudan? I mean, obviously, it's as you said, it finds itself in a rock and a hard place when it comes to stability and even its future. But still, I want to ask, what do you think the future of Sudan holds, and how can political actors, especially in the US or even the EU, who has a certain kind of interest to the regional stability, especially in the context of the refugee crisis in 2015 in Syria. What do you think they could do, and what does the future for Sudan hold at the moment?
I don't think either party can win this conflict. This is a stalemate where it's a bit like First World War, where in one offensive, one party gains a bit of land, and then a couple of months later, the other party wins their territory back. I do think that seizing all of Darfur for the RSF is important because that's an area that they can defend. They are able to bog down, dig in, and defend that territory against the SAF. But I don't think the RSF is able to actually seize Khartoum, for example. So we're basically going towards a potential either succession, or as what the Emiratis are telling the Americans is once Darfur is secured, the RSF has a strong enough bargaining power, then we can go to the negotiation table and make sure that we come to some sort of agreement where the RSF is part of either power sharing or they're getting a sort of federal status where Darfur becomes semi-autonomous. Something similar that the Emiratis have been pushing in Yemen, where their proxy, the STC, their surrogate, is pushing for either secession or a form of power sharing and autonomy. And so the Emiratis could be pushing for that. But I also don't think the RSF is a player that you can bring to the negotiation table. And even if they do negotiate, they're not a reliable actor. I don't think Hemedti is someone who will honor his word and his signature. So I think over time this will go back to another round of a conflict. So I think the conflict will continue, whether overtly or as a simmering conflict. But I also don't think either side has got enough capacity and capability to effectively win on the battlefield. So we're looking at a protracted conflict, unfortunately. The Europeans have no role to play in this. The Europeans are powerless. They're toothless. They also have no spine in this because obviously it's quite clear now that the UAE is a main funder of the RSF. There's so much evidence that's come out over the last 2 years with names of individuals involved, names of companies involved, of the entire route has been broken down from the UAE all the way to the battlefield. What are the different stepping stones? What are the different hubs that the Emiratis is using? What are the means and ways that they're using to get the arms to them? It's all overt. It's not, we're not looking at intelligence reports. This is all in the open. It's public knowledge. And so European diplomats know that. And they still choose not to call out the Emiratis because they fear that the Emiratis have quite a lot of leverage over them, and which is true. In the relationship between the EU and the UAE is probably in a much more powerful position because, number one, they're a major energy producer, and Europe is has a lot of energy insecurity. Secondly, the Europeans need investment. The European economies are not doing well, so they need investments, and the UAE is a major investor. I mean, they spend billions, they invest billions in critical national infrastructure. And so in this kind of relation, the Emiratis don't need the Europeans, as unfortunately, that's how it looks like now. This power balance has shifted over the last 10 years. And the Europeans don't want to call out the Emiratis because they fear the Emiratis will punish them for it. And they probably will, because they're very transactional. MBZ is a very transactional man. And so the Europeans are quiet. They also don't have any leverage anymore. The UK is probably the only country that has some leverage because of their legacy in Sudan. The Sudanese people look at the UK as a potential protector, as standing up for what is right. But the UK obviously also economic stress and have their own problems with the UAE at the moment. But we would want to see the UK taking a stronger position and a stronger leading role and convening role in this. And then you have the US in the Quad. The problem with the US is that the Trump administration is not really interested in anything but big headlines. And so the UAE are promising Trump at the moment a big headline by saying we're going to solve whatever it is now, the 11th or 12th conflict that Trump has allegedly solved. And the UAE could provide him that. But that will not mean Trump will see this through. As we see in Gaza, he's happy with the headline, but he's very bad at implementing it.
Thank you, Dr. Andreas Krieg. You have given a very insightful, a overview, but very at the same time insightful overview of the entire situation. Thank you for joining the podcast, and I'm looking forward for another talk in the future, but maybe more deep dive in some of the issues that we addressed. Thank you very much.